Okay, so this is talk 16 in the Judgment Seat of Christ series. What I'm doing now is starting chapter 5 from the book of that same name. And so in the book I've entitled it Additional Points About the Judgment Seat of Christ, largely because it's a series of miscellaneous things that didn't work their way into previous chapters. So I'm going to try and work through those in these next few talks. So, first point I would make is that it surely has to be the most important thing in the end is to hear Jesus Christ praising you at the judgment seat. Wouldn't that be a very thrilling and moving and awesome experience? And what's surprising is that somehow that doesn't seem to connect with us, and we don't seem to think about it now in the way that we ought to. But we ought to think of it as something immense. So imagine that you knew that you were going to Buckingham Palace to receive a knighthood or a peerage or some kind of OBE or something like that. You were going to be invited to join the Order of Merit or become a fellow of the Royal Society or something of that nature. Do you think you'd get round to mentioning it to your neighbours or to your friends or to your relatives? Would you think about it? Would it cross your mind to think about it? If you knew that in the new year you're going to Buckingham Palace to become a Knight of the Garter or something, do you think you would manage to think about it? Would it cross your mind? I think it would. And, well, what if you were going to Buckingham Palace to find out whether you were getting a knighthood? Or to find out whether you were getting something else, a rebuke. So imagine it wasn't a guaranteed reward, but rather finding out whether there's a reward. And you knew that sometime in January, you're heading over to Buckingham Palace for a personal interview, at which you'll either get made a duke, or you'll be rebuked soundly. Do you imagine that you would find a moment or two in each day to think about that and reflect on it a little tiny bit? I think you would. Now the thing is, why don't we think about the judgment seat? This is the question. And I think largely because we've been conditioned not to. We've had a lifetime of not thinking about it. We've had a lifetime of not being taught about it. We've had a lifetime of thinking about other things, and we don't have a tradition of thinking about this. So we need to create our own tradition within our own life. If there isn't a tradition for us to latch onto, then you'll have to just make your own. But it ought to be something that you think about, because it is such an important thing, and such a thing for you to want. But this is what, Chris, do you want to read out from 2 Chronicles, chapter 29, verses 1 and 2? This is what the Bible had to say about King Hezekiah.
Hezekiah became king when he was 25 years old, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah. He did right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. Okay, and that verse 2 is just a short phrase, but this is God summarising what he thinks about Hezekiah. Now, would you not like to have that said about you? Now, he did right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. Would you like to be compared to David? That's pretty much what you'd call a superlative, isn't it? I would. Now, am I not stating the utterly obvious that that is right to want that, that you should want that? And yet, why is it therefore that we don't think about that and don't want that? Or even many times as I've discussed this subject with people, I've encountered this belief that there's something wrong with wanting that. There's something wrong with hoping for that. Notwithstanding that God frequently gives his opinion of people in the Bible. He does it in the Bible. He's going to do it to us. Look at the way that God speaks instead about King Ahaz, a very different assessment. To read that, Vicky, from King... is it 1 Kings or 2 Kings? I don't know. It's Kings anyway, but the typing's missed off. Chapter 16, verse 2.
Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, And he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord his God, as his father David had done.
Okay, so the things that God says about the kings are obviously usually very brief, but they're very powerful and penetrating. Now, I think at the judgment seat we're going to get a far more detailed appraisal than that. But these are the management summaries of each of these kings that we get in the Bible. And God does not pull his punches. He tells it like it is about each of them. And I don't think we have any reason to think that he will pull his punches with us, or that he won't feel able to speak to us like it really is. So remember as well.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Just going to say, do you think that there's possibly a kind of a fatalism attached to this?
In what sense that?
In the sense that you're going to be judged.
Yeah.
You're going to be judged anyway.
Yes.
And because we're sinners, all have sinned.
Yeah.
In looking at it from that sort of perspective.
Yeah. Oh, I see. So your question is, you say, is there a fatalism about this? Because we're all sinners, are you meaning, therefore, it's inevitable they will all receive a bad judgment, a bad assessment?
Well, possibly.
Okay. Well, I think to think that way is to confuse what the judgment seat's about, because sin isn't really on the agenda. Because if you go to the judgment seat, then the one thing that's not going to be judged is sin, because that's the one thing that's not on the agenda that day, because that's already been dealt with. So it's, by definition, the only people who are going to be at the judgment seat are the people whose sin is not going to be talked about that day. So that's the one thing that's not going to be assessed, because it's as far as the east is from the west. It's been forgotten by God, it's been forgiven. So sin is the wrong word. It isn't sin that's being assessed that day. It's fruit, faithfulness, output, productivity, usefulness, and so forth. All those things, the fruit of the Holy Spirit, it's all those things which are not sin. And so what's being assessed is the presence or absence of those things, the quantity of those things, the consistency of those things. So, in a sense, we're sort of measuring temperature in decibels, aren't we, by trying to measure those things in sin. Those are not measured in terms of sin. And so what's being measured at the judgment seat is something altogether different. And so if it was the case that everybody was going to be assessed on that day as a sinner, well then we'd all be just the same, really, give or take a bit. The point is, where we differ markedly, we're all the same in terms of being sinners, perhaps a little different in degree and in precisely what we do, but we're very different in terms of our fruit and output, productivity, effectiveness, faithfulness, and so forth. Very different. And so some people will have had a whole lifetime of faithful service, and some people would have had a whole lifetime of neglect, dilatoriness, disobedience, unfaithfulness, fearfulness, cowardice, complying with the world's values, dodging issues, dodging responsibility, preachers that don't preach the truth because they're scared to, etc. You name it, on and on and on it will go. There are so many things where believers are not displaying faithfulness, or where they are displaying it. And in those areas, the contrast is massive within the church. So, remember also that whatever Jesus' assessment of you is, it's going to stand for all eternity. So it's not like this. It's not that you'll go to the judgment seat and you'll get like an interim report. And he'll say, look, here's the interim report on how I think you're doing so far, but what I want you to do is improve now during the millennium, and then improve during the eternal state, and then I'll reassess you later. That's not what he's going to say. So what will be said on that day will stand for all time and all eternity. So if you're made a duke on that day, you'll stay a duke for all eternity. If you're made a baron, you'll stay a baron for all eternity. If you're made a commoner, if you're made a parish councillor, that's what you'll be for all eternity. Do you see? So it's of huge significance what is said to you on that day, because it's not an interim report. It's not a progress report. Now, where do we get progress reports? Where do we get interim reports? Here and now. Where do we get them from? From the Bible, from other people, from being corrected. So why then is it so important to listen to correction and to welcome it? Because that's your interim report. So if someone comes up to you and wants to say something to you, the general reaction is people don't want to be criticised, don't want to be corrected. You see? That's the normal reaction of the old man, the flesh nature, doesn't want correction. But imagine you had a massive IQ. Imagine that your IQ didn't have brackets around it, but was big, in triple figures, and you were clever and wise. What would you want? Given that you can't have an interim appraisal at the judgment seat, what would a wise person want here and now from other people and from the Bible? Well, I would put it to you that a wise person would want criticism, rebuke, correction. A wise person would want brave people to come up to him and say, look, I'm just thinking something would you mind if I just shared something with you I think you might not know, or that I think you might not be aware of that you're doing. Now, anyone who's brave enough to do that is the kind of person that would win the Victoria Cross in the army. Not many people in the church brave enough to do that to anybody. Now, one of the reasons people aren't brave enough to do that to anybody is because 99% of the time, if you did that to somebody, you'd get a black eye, wouldn't you? You would get a black eye and you would be ostracized. That person would despise you and hate you, because if you rebuke a fool, he'll hate you. So if you were to correct a person, they would hate you. Now, can you see how foolish that is? Because I'm talking now about Christians, not talking about unbelievers. There are fools in the church, there are thousands of them in the church, who don't want to be rebuked or corrected or criticised. But can you see the point? If you were to have, say, a 50-year span as a Christian, and if in that time, you were corrected 100 times, 200 times, imagine how that would improve your performance at the judgment seat. If you listened every time someone criticised you. And then, this is much more important even than that, you should read the Bible. One of your focuses when you're reading the Bible is you're looking for what it says to criticise you. Now, I find that's not what people are doing. My impression, at least, as far as I can tell, is most people are reading the Bible in a self-affirming way, and they see in it only continual affirmation of who and what they are and what they do. They see continual praise for themselves in it. They see continual endorsement of what they believe, what they do, what they say, how they act, how they think. Now, I'm at a loss to know how you can get through a chapter of the Bible without being criticised, because it's been written to criticise you. Now, you might say, well, therefore, that means God's not very pleasant. He's criticising us. He's not nice. On the contrary, the wisest and best thing that a parent can do is to correct as you go along, to chastise, to scold, to discipline, to correct you. If you had a good boss, wouldn't he correct you? So, the point is we should read the Bible in order to be corrected, not in order to congratulate ourselves about the current and ongoing perfect condition of our beliefs, our attitudes, our behaviour, our values, our everything. Do you see? Now, I'm probably putting it a touch strongly, but what I've just said is pretty close to being how most people think and read the Bible. So the standard assumption is that whatever you currently believe is right, whatever you currently think is right, whatever attitude you currently have are right, your behaviour is right, and so wrong behaviour is something by definition which is done by others to you. Right behaviour is what you do to people. Now that sounds ridiculous when I say it now, but I would suggest to you that that's very close to how most Christians think. Now it's very far from how God thinks. And when he writes the Bible, he's giving you an ongoing opportunity to find criticism about yourself. And if you're open to it, what you can do each day is find something whereby you can bring forward the day of judgment for yourself and receive an interim report and act upon it and alter the outcome, which will one day be the real thing, which will stand for all eternity. Now, do you need an IQ in triple figures to manage to think that? I don't think you do. I think the mid-50s would be enough to get you to understand that. But why then don't most of us understand that? Anyway, I'll leave that point with you.
Can I just ask you a question?
Yeah.
It's just something that you said earlier about when we're standing there, like if we've been coward.
Yeah.
Because it says, doesn't it say in Revelation that no coward
Yeah.
will inherit the kingdom? Or, you know, there's a lot of, not just cowardice, there's lots of, and there's something about outer darkness with gnashing of teeth. How does that come into, is that for believers as well? Because there's the sort
Well,
of...
the outer darkness passage, that's going to need a lot of explaining and talking about. And it's also a very controversial passage where a lot of people have different views. Some people think that that means going to the lake of fire. And I know that Chuck Missler's written most of a whole book on this point, and he takes the view that it doesn't mean that at all. And I think he's probably right. And so the outer darkness that's spoken of means to be at the edge of the kingdom, to be at the edge of the festivities, to be at the edge. And when you think about it, the whole point of the judgment is to give people roles, titles, positions. People are going to be at the top part of the table or the bottom part of the table. And so the gnashing of teeth in the outer darkness, I personally believe, is not talking about the lake of fire. It's talking about people who are saved and in the kingdom, but who have an ongoing regret, a deep regret, at the way they lived and the way they blew it. Do you see? Well, how would you feel if we went to some place or time where we discovered that the way we'd been living had blown it for us and we were not going to receive a whole host of things for eternity that we would otherwise have received? Wouldn't that cause you to gnash your teeth? I think it would. And so that's my understanding of that. But people differ on that.
That's still a whole lot better than being in the lake of fire.
Indeed, yes. If you had to choose between those two, it's not going to be a hard choice. The point is that we've got to get used to the idea that the day of judgment is not just about handing out rewards. Because insofar as it is ever spoken about, which it hardly ever is, but on those very rare occasions when the day of judgment for Christians is ever mentioned, 90% of the time, if it is ever mentioned, it's spoken of as a uniquely and exclusively positive experience where all of us will receive rewards, and the assumption is that we'll pretty much all get the same reward. And my submission to you is that there is no basis whatsoever for thinking that. Simply isn't any conceivable basis for forming that conclusion. So, as I was saying, what Jesus assesses you as will stand for all eternity. So you'll either be a parish councillor or a duke, or not a parish councillor at all. You might not even be on the parish council for all eternity. And you'll either, therefore, go forward from the day of judgment with joy and satisfaction forever, or with a sense of deep, ongoing, profound regret. And I'm talking now about people who are in the kingdom, not people in the lake of fire. So, also, many people are going to be surprised and many will be disappointed at the judgment seat. And as far as I can see, and I don't know what is in everybody's mind, but insofar as, because people keep telling me that I say things as if I know, so when I say, well, especially when I'm talking on Twitter, I can't preface every tweet by saying, in my opinion, on the basis of what I've currently seen, bearing in mind I could be wrong. By the time I get to that, I've run out of characters. So if you assume that I always mean that, in my opinion, bearing in mind what I've seen, to the limited extent that I can read other people's minds and assess their performance, what I think is that there's hardly a person on this earth who accurately sees themselves as God sees them, or at any rate who consistently sees themselves as God sees them. And so broadly we fall into two camps. There are many who are substantially and consistently self-congratulatory and self-affirming and see in themselves nothing but ongoing rightness and the model of perfection in the way that they are and think. And they see themselves as the measure of what a person should be. And you will spot these people because they use the word they when they talk about sin. So if ever the word they is coming out of your mouth when you're talking about sin, you're probably in that group, in the self-affirming group. Now those people, when they get to the judgment seat, are going to be in for some pretty nasty surprises and shocks. But there's another group, I think a smaller group, which is incapable of seeing anything right in themselves, and who see themselves always as underperforming, doing it wrongly, not doing enough, that God isn't pleased with them, they're not very good, they're not contributing much, they aren't doing much, etc. That's a smaller group, but I think that some of those people will be in for some surprises too, in the sense that they'll find Jesus praising them. So the point is that at the judgment day there are going to be some radical shocks and surprises in both directions, with people being absolutely amazed at being rebuked. A little bit like Andrew Mitchell was the other day when he lost his libel case. And he foolishly risked millions of pounds on a libel case and lost it. And apparently he was totally stunned when the judgment came back that he'd lost, and the judge believed the other man, not him. Now, there'll be that stunned reaction on the faces of many people at the judgment seat as they discover that their glowing appraisal of themselves is not shared by Jesus. There'll also be a stunned reaction on the faces of some people when they discover that Jesus makes them a viscount or an earl or a duke or some such equivalent, with a corresponding crown or reward or title that he gives. And they think, what, me? Have you got the wrong chap? And he'll say, no, I've got the right chap. I mean you. Well, I was never famous. Nobody ever heard of me. I lived my whole life helping a small tribe in Africa. No one's ever heard of me. You say, that's right. I've heard of you. Do you see? So, both groups see themselves inaccurately, but for opposite reasons. So one group is overly confident, does not engage in any or much self-examination, does not see the Bible as a critical book that's pointing out things in which they need to change. When you describe it to them as a book that points out the need for change, they don't recognize that. They've not noticed it. And then, by contrast, the other group is sincere, is earnest, is repentant, and often overly critical and incapable of seeing anything valuable in what they're doing. And both groups are getting it wrong, and both groups are going to be surprised at the judgment. So, we do need, therefore, to examine ourselves as rigorously and honestly as we can. If we will do that and practice it, you can absolutely be sure it's going to benefit you once you start to do it. So I don't mean by this, by the way, going around telling lies to impress others about how humble you are. Oh, I'm no good. I can't do anything. I'm not contributing anything. I'm useless. I am. That's false, and that's not sincere. I don't mean that at all, because when people speak in that way, sometimes they're looking for affirmation from others. So I don't mean that. What do we mean then? Is an open, sincere willingness an eagerness to be corrected and an eagerness to find in the Bible advice about how to change, and little or no propensity to use the word they when speaking about sin and sinners. Okay? The pronoun we should be used when speaking about sinners, and when the Bible speaks of sin and sinners, that should be what springs to mind. I, we, me, not they, he, and so on. And as we then do that, we can change the things we're doing. And that change is known otherwise as growing in the fruit of the Holy Spirit. That's how it comes about, by changing. And change is largely the product of a decision to want to change. It is not all done by God for you. It's a joint venture between you and God. So it is true to say that you can't do it all on your own, but it is also true to say that God won't do it all for you. So the change comes through a willing participation in a joint venture with God, whereby you want to be changed and agree to it, and he helps you. That's the only way. So, it's true also to say, and this is sometimes, I think, something people forget, that God is pleased with every part of our progress, even when we're a long way from the finishing line. Because the point is, you don't ever actually reach the finishing line. Because the finishing line, if you wanted to give it a definition, would be this. It would be becoming so sanctified in your actual day-to-day life that you have now achieved the actual level of righteousness that Jesus Christ showed when he was on the earth. Now that would be the finishing line. So that's why I say nobody ever reaches the finishing line. You can't reach the finishing line in that sense, because you can never be that sanctified this side of death. But what you can do is get as far towards it as you can. And so you could be moving and progressing in that way. And if you are a sincere person, a self-analytical, self-critical person, you'll be progressing in that direction but not being aware of it, because the further you get in that direction, you'll become ever more conscious of the remaining sin that is there in you. And I used the analogy earlier in another book, I think, about if you are a small boy, aged about 9, your hands are dirty, but you don't care. And the only reason you wash your hands is because your mum makes you wash your hands. But what about the boy's mum? The boy's not bothered about germs on his hands at all, but he's got loads of them. What about his mum? She's got cleaner hands. Her hands are much, much less dirty than his and far fewer germs, but she's much more bothered about germs than he is. All right, well, what about a chef? His hands are cleaner than the mum's hands, but he's more bothered about the germs that are still on his hands than the mother is about her hands. And yet his hands are cleaner, but he's more bothered about the germs that remain. Or what about a surgeon who operates on newborns? His hands are cleaner than a chef's hands, but he's more bothered about the germs that are still on his hands than the chef is about the germs that it might still be on his hands. Do you see? So the cleaner your hands become, in a certain sense, as we say, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? He that has clean hands. The cleaner your hands become, the more concerned you will become about the cleanness of your hands. Do you see? So there's a kind of counterintuitive aspect to this, in that the people with the cleanest hands will think they have the dirty hands. The people with the dirtiest hands will think they've got clean hands. Do you see how it works? So, therefore, it follows, you could be very surprised at the judgment to find that God thinks your hands are quite clean relative to where you'd had got to, and be pleased with you when you think he would not be. And conversely, the opposite. You could be thinking that he's going to be impressed with the cleanness of your hands, and in fact he's not. So let's look at the generation of Israelites who came out of Egypt and crossed the Red Sea. Because this is a group of people with whom God was not pleased. So, Chris, would you like to read from 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 to 12?
I want you to know, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same supernatural food, and all drank the same supernatural drink. For they drank from the supernatural rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things are warnings for us, not to desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to dance. We must not indulge in immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put the Lord to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as a warning, but they were written down for our instruction, upon whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall.
Okay, well that's Apostle Paul speaking in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. That generation, have you ever wondered why God was so angry with that generation? Why that particular generation, the one that left Egypt? Why were they so particularly criticised and harshly judged? Well, I think the principal reason why they were, because in many ways they were not worse than other generations, but there was one very material thing about them that was very different, almost even unique in comparison to other generations. And that is the amount of revelation they had. What they had seen, what they knew, what they had had demonstrated in front of them. They had seen the water of the Red Sea form two walls and make a channel for them. They'd seen the River Jordan stack up on either side so that they could walk across it. They had seen the Egyptians drowned in the Red Sea, and so on. They had seen all of the plagues that came upon Egypt while they were there. They'd seen themselves escape from Egypt. They'd seen what God had done and how he'd met with Moses in the wilderness and how the pillar of fire led them in the day and so forth, and the night and so on. They'd seen all that, and they had nevertheless been unbelieving and disobedient. Now think about it. If you engage your massive IQ, do you think they had more or less revelation than us? That's not an easy question to answer. They had more direct, face-to-face revelation, but do you believe that the Red Sea parted any more or less than they did? I believe in the parting of the Red Sea exactly as much as they do. I don't believe it any less than they do. I totally believe it did. And I believe all the plagues of Egypt, and I believe all these things. Moreover, these fellas had not got a single book, even of Moses, to read. What they had got was visible manifestations of God's power and presence. Well, we've got 66 books of the Bible to read. So we have, I think you have to conclude in the end, more revelation than them. So think about it. If God was angry with them for their unbelief and their disobedience and their disregard and their disrespect and their ingratitude and their complaining in the context of what they had, I mean, how would you like to go across the wilderness and live on manna and worry about the cold and the night and the heat in the day? And do you think a complaint might cross your lips even once in 30 or 40 years? It's possible. I mean, if you were to stretch your imagination, you could possibly concede it could happen. I think, but can see how angry God was about it. And therefore, why do we assume that that generation was a very, very bad generation? And of course, we would never complain or be ungrateful or be disobedient or unbelieving or disrespectful or lacking faithfulness or enthusiasm or diligence. Well, that doesn't add up, does it? In fact, we would be all those things, and more so than them. So that's why I say that the judgment seat will be for many a very shocking experience, because you can't all in the kingdom of God be right up there with the apostles at the table. We're not all going to be dukes, are we? There's going to be a lot of people who find themselves much lower in the kingdom than they expected to be. But not only that, but being rebuked. But that's why I say again, you can avoid imitating that generation. See, even Apostle Paul says here, this very thing was written down for you as a warning, for your instruction. So that everything in the Bible is written down as a warning and for your instruction. What does God want you to do, therefore, with this account of the generation that came out of Egypt? What he wants you to do is reflect upon it. Now, is God interested in your opinion about that generation, and for you to form a view of that generation and scold that generation and criticize that generation? Not in the least. What then is the purpose of him telling you about that generation? Which generation is he wanting you to think about and criticize? And which member of that generation is he particularly wanting you to criticize and compare with them? So what he wants you to do when you read about the account of the Israelites coming out of Egypt is you say, this group were criticized for complaining. I complain a lot. I need to stop. This group was criticized for unbelief. I have a lot of unbelief. I need to stop. This group was criticized for making idols. I think I may be making some idols. I need to stop. Do you see? This group was criticized for not listening to Moses. I don't really listen to Moses. I don't listen to any of the prophets either. I don't even listen to the apostles. I need to stop doing that. I need to start listening to them. Do you see? Now that is the proper way in which to read that passage, because God is not giving you these passages so that you can criticize that generation of Israelites. It's absolutely not his purpose. And if there were any doubt about the matter, Paul has taken the doubt away, because he's just said, it's been given to you as a warning. It was written down for your instruction. And therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. What he's saying is, if you think that you've got it all together and that you're really the bee's knees and you're just a great Christian, and I mean, nobody goes around saying, I'm a great Christian. I've never actually heard anyone say that, but it's in the hearts of people to think that they are the standard of what a Christian should be. I've seen that and heard that in people's tone of voice hundreds of times. The assumption, the sort of implicit, latent assumption that they are the standard of what a person should be. And that's dangerous, a dangerous thing to do and think. So what we're going to go on to next, in the next talk, I'll just introduce what I'm going to go on to, is to look at the assessments that Jesus makes in his 7 letters in the book of Revelation. Now, you can, if you're in a pub quiz and you want to start an argument at the end of the quiz, and the question is how many books are there in the Bible? And the answer, the quizmaster will give the answer 66. You could start an argument by saying it's not, it's 73, because there's another 7 here from Jesus, the 7 letters in the book of Revelation. Now, what are these 7 letters about? In this context, well, I think that they give us a very good insight into the way that he'll conduct the judgment seat. The 7 letters that Jesus is writing, he's dictating them to the Apostle John to pass on to 7 real churches in Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey. Now, each of these 7 churches are given a frank assessment of how they are doing, how they're getting on. And you'll notice from the 7 letters With some of the churches, Jesus is surprisingly tender and generous with them. But with some of them, he's extremely frank and blunt with them. With some of them, he's a bit of both. A bit of praise, a bit of criticism. And so he appears to be particularly gracious and understanding towards those churches where the people have had to suffer on his account. But he's at his most forthright with those churches who are complacent, self-satisfied, lukewarm. Now, if we make this if we think now we're Westerners, and just think from a Western perspective for just a moment, which of those broad groups most resembles us? The suffering church that's had to suffer grievously, or a church that's having it easy, doesn't have to suffer, self-satisfied, complacent, casual, lukewarm? I think we fall into that broad group in the main. But note that to that broad group, Jesus is quite blunt in the things he says. And to the other group that are suffering for him, he's quite tender and gracious and generous and patient in the things he says. And so, if we look at these, you can see as well that what we'll see as we go through these letters in the next talk, there's a broad pattern to this, that nearly every one of these churches is surprised by what Jesus says to them. Hardly any of them seem to have got their own assessment of themselves right. They're all either surprised that he's praising them or surprised that he's criticizing them. And also, bear this in mind, these were all churches. Underline the word churches. These were not unbelievers. He wasn't writing this to the town hall in each of these towns to criticize the unbelieving members of the town council and the way they were running the town. That's not who he's writing to. Each of these letters are written to churches who are churches. And even in the worst of them, they're still churches. So you mustn't think that Jesus will not criticize churches or Christians. And also, if you do think that, then you have to come up with an answer as to why he would be willing to criticize these Christians, but he would never be willing to criticize you. Do you see? He would be willing to criticize the church in Laodicea, but he would never be willing to criticize St. Dudar's or St. Thingamajig's church in your village or town where you are. Okay. So in the next talk, I'm going to look at some brief extracts from each of the 7 letters, and I think they're going to give us a handle or an indication of how we will be dealt with at the judgment seat. Okay.